Hi, and welcome to another episode of Drafting Notes, the sister podcast to our main podcast, Page One, the Writers Podcast. That's a lot of podcasts. Where that's a sort of interview podcast where we get great guests on the podcast, but this one is more short form, where Tariq and I like to try and discuss one small aspect of the writing life, I guess. And one thing we were both thinking about actually was, and it's something that comes up a lot with our guests as well, is the difference between writing a short story and writing long form fiction, and how helpful one is to the other and all of that sort of stuff. Because I know when you first started writing, you were doing short stories rather than immediately trying to write a novel. I think that's right.
That's right. Yeah, I definitely get away into. I think, like as you say, like most writers do. I think look at the idea of writing a full length novel and think that seems quite big and a lot of work. And I don't really know if I'd have the capacity to stretch a story out. But short stories are kind of a nice way in. And I think short stories are great because you can do a lot of the same techniques with a novel, can't you? You're still doing dialogue and character and plot and stuff, just a lot more condensed. And I certainly started off like that. Yeah, I was at a kind of writers group, so once a week we would meet and there'd be a new topic and we would write a short story on that topic, and then the next week you just share it and read it out loud and kind of break it down. And there wasn't anything beyond that. There wasn't any teaching or anything involved in it. It was just a case of writing a short story and sharing it. But the good thing about it for me was that there was a deadline of a week to write a story, and so it made me actually sit down and write and finish something.
Yeah, I mean,
that's struggle with sometimes.
Yeah, that sort of exercise, I guess, is good for getting into that habit of writing, which is
exactly,
something that we've talked about in the main podcast as being quite important. Just sort of getting into that routine is very, very important, because it's very easy always as a writer to say, I'll just do it tomorrow. I'll think about it today, but I'll do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
But getting into the habit of doing it every day is obviously useful. But having said that, I think short fiction is entirely different as a skill to writing a novel. And I say that as someone that has strangely, I would say that I prefer writing long form fiction. That's what I think that I am
Why is
good
that?
at.
What's the difference?
Because just the stories that I think of, I can never. They always grow. They always grow arms and legs. Too many.
You do love a nice, complicated, complex.
Yeah, exactly. So to focus on and I think that's what the best short fiction takes, a very small aspect and focuses on it and tells a gripping or emotional tale in those few thousand words, and that takes skill to be able to do that, to get a reader involved,
100%
and to get a reader engaged with the characters so quickly that they really care about it. I said it was strange that I prefer long form fiction, because the only thing that I've actually had published so far is a short story.
Well, let's chat about that then. So you've had a short story published.
Yeah.
What was the process there? Like, what did you have? Did you like to sit down and write short stories, or did you kind of see a potential outlet and think, I'm going to write something specifically for that outlet?
No, it was actually just... So what I think short fiction can be useful for is experimenting, because you're not committing yourself to a long-form story. And I just had a very vague idea that I wanted to tell a story about the seed vault in Svalbard. In Antarctica, is it? Or... the Arctic, I'm not sure.
One of the two.
Yeah, one of the two.
One of the poles.
Yeah, exactly. But so I had this idea, and I just sort of started, and I also just had this scene in my head of someone being lost in the snow and encountering some sort of strange thing, because it was a sort of sci-fi concept that I had in my head.
Yeah.
And I just started writing it, and I experimenting, because I wrote it in first person, which is not something that I normally write in for my long form fiction. And it's just something that I enjoyed doing, and I sort of, as I was writing it, felt that I knew where it was going until the end. I had to have a few goes at how to wrap it up, but I felt it was enough of a snapshot picture that told a story that worked as a short story, in a way that, uh, you know, telling a bigger story in that world, you certainly could, but I felt it worked better just zooming in on that moment in time.
Yeah.
So, but as I say, that isn't the normal approach for me. Normally, um, I like to have my full, you know, I'm more of a planner, as you know, and so I like to have a full idea of what I'm writing and things like that. But what I think short fiction can be useful for, even if you do write long form fiction, is to experiment
Yeah.
in different forms, in different, whether it's perspectives, whether it's present tense, if you always write in past tense, or you know, all of that sort of stuff can be, you can experiment with it more easily in the short form
Yeah.
than you can, and also it is also potentially, if you can do it, it's an easier route to publication.
Yep.
Now I know,
Yep.
I'm not, I don't mean to say it's easy to get published with short stories. It certainly isn't. But there's, you know, there's more ways
there's
to get
competitions,
published.
there's
Yeah.
magazines and stuff. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of good points there. I completely agree with you on the experimentation side of things. I think it is, and I know we've chatted to a few people on the podcast who have used it for that exact reason, to test a writing technique out before they employ it to its full in their next book. And I think that's a great idea of doing that. And I would certainly rather be drawn to that, to experiment in that, than to write a few scenes and experiment in it. I think having a short story gives you that kind of an arc you can do, that kind of satisfaction if you close it off. And also I think when you're finished with it, even if you're using it purely as an experimental thing, I think having, which is what I don't have this, but I like the idea of having a few short stories kind of sitting there under your belt, because you never know when something comes up that you might want to use a short story for. You know, there's competitions suddenly get announced, you think, actually my one would fit that one. Or I know people give them out as part of subscriptions for newsletters and stuff, so that there's lots of ways you can use short stories
for that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, for sure.
They're definitely useful for giving people a sample of your writing and trying to attract new readers and things like that. So I think that is useful, and I feel that if you have written long form fiction in a universe or in a world or something like that, then it can maybe be easier to then write a bit of short fiction in that world, because the readers aren't having to learn about the world because it's already set up and things like that. So you can just jump into a moment and tell a story like that.
Yeah, it's a great show.
So you don't have to do all that setup of things. But then again, one of the beauties of short fiction is that you don't need to answer all the questions and you don't need to establish everything. That's the point of, and that's where I struggle, to be honest, because I always think, well, wait, why is this happening? Why is that? But the point is,
I know, right?
The best short stories can just drop you in. You don't know anything, but you sort of pick things up as you're reading it, and it won't answer all the questions.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think also, you know, look at the way that I'm thinking of Hugh Howey with his Wool novel. I know that started off as kind of short stories, and when you read the first book, certainly you can see that from the book. The first 3 or 4 big chunks are short stories, and then the last half is a full kind of novella-length story, I guess. And then he binds it together and sells it as one book.
Yeah.
But I think it just shows you that, I think, you know, he obviously had no intention when he wrote that of it being this bigger story. It was a short story that kind of grew, and so I think there's always lots of things you can do with short stories. You never know where it might take you. But I think I'm definitely all for using short stories as means of experimenting, as side stories in established worlds, or you know, just fleshing your creative muscles a little bit. And maybe you'll do 2, 3 more, maybe you'll string them together. I mean, with mine, I certainly started off doing one short story in a kind of detective story that I kind of thought, maybe this is the first chapter of a bigger story rather than a self-contained thing. And so you never know where it takes you, and I want to do more of them because I really do enjoy them. They're shorter, they're done, and you can walk away from them afterwards.
Like we've had Mike Carey on the main podcast a couple of times, and I think his the Book of Coley, it grew out of a short story he'd written.
That's right.
Essentially, and he quite liked the character and the voice that he'd found there. And that's the thing, you can experiment with voice and things like that.
Yeah.
And then that obviously developed into a trilogy of books that were very well received. But I think one way to improve your short fiction, in fact, definitely a way to improve your short fiction, and it's not something I do enough of, which is maybe why I struggle with short stories, is read more short fiction.
Yeah.
Because that, I know, I've spoken to people that are very good at short fiction, and they said one of the ways that they started to understand how to write good short stories was that they began to read it. I think one of them actually worked reading Slush Pile for a magazine.
Oh, okay.
And that helped them,
Yeah.
it very quickly became clear what stories worked, what stories didn't.
Yeah.
And that helped them develop their own skills then in telling short stories.
Yeah. And I think there's also, when you say I want to write a short story, there's also so many different types of short stories, isn't there? There's I'm thinking now purely just the length of it. You've got your flash fiction, your sub 100 words, really tight, focused stuff, and you've got your 5,000, 10,000. At what point does it become a larger, longer form story? But I think there's a real skill when you get down to that nitty gritty end, and I definitely have read quite a lot of that kind of really tight flash fiction, and sometimes the amount of I was going to say plot's the wrong word, because you're not trying to crush a full story into that. You're just trying to give that, as you said, that flavor, just enough that you let your brain do most of the heavy lifting, and just the tip, and I think you need to be really clear with yourself. What is the purpose of this short story? What am I trying to evoke an emotion? Is it all building up to a twist ending? Is it just a monologue? What I think you need to be really clear and sparse, and pick one thing and focus on that one thing and do it well, and not try to say I'm going to tell a 70,000 word story in 10,000 words.
That's exactly. That's what you shouldn't be doing. I think that's a mistake that I have certainly made before as well.
That's what I do. Exactly.
You have to just be focusing on this short thing, and you're right with things like flash fiction is incredible, the people that
some
do
stuff's
that well,
amazing,
because it can pull you in that tiny amount of words. You can totally picture the scene in your head. You even can kind of get a view of what had happened just before you're in this scene. It builds out beyond the words on the page, and that's what great short fiction can do. I think it's not just that you're getting a snapshot of it, but you're also getting a feel for the larger thing around it.
Absolutely,
and that's why I think it's a real skill. I mean, there's a skill obviously in writing a long form novel.
And keeping that going for that length, and juggling all the balls for that many words.
We've had guests that have said both things. I just can't write short fiction, or I just struggle when I write longer fiction. It's not something that every writer is going to be good at. If you're good at long form, it doesn't mean you'll be good at short fiction, and vice versa. It's just they're different skills. And while I think practicing for your own benefit can help you hone things, it may be that, if you or I write short fiction, mainly we're using it to try out a voice or a POV or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then we take that on and use it in a novel. So it's valuable in that sense, but to become successful in it is something else entirely. And there are some fantastic short fiction anthologies and things like that.
And they get a lot of. I feel often short stories get a lot more buzz sometimes. Like I know, like Radio 4 did their short story competition every year, and they get read out, one a week, one a day of the week. It's a real event about it. And
that lends itself to that, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Exactly, yeah. And I suppose that's a nice thing about shorter fiction, is that it can be read out in one go, or it can be, you can easily digest it.
Well, I mean, we just had Chris McQueer on the main podcast.
That's right. Exactly.
He started out writing stories on Twitter, and then had developed shorter fiction anthologies and things like that before he's then moved on to his first novel. And you know, he grew his skills by writing that short fiction, but also then by doing spoken word and reading them out on stage and things like that.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
the short fiction obviously allows that in a way that longer fiction doesn't. What short fiction doesn't do generally is pay you good money. You know,
Yes,
even
that's a good point.
even if you're getting in some of the, you know, most esteemed short fiction magazines and stuff like that, you're not getting paid a lot of money.
No.
So you don't.
And I
do
think
it for
short
that,
story
that's for sure.
anthologies don't sell
No,
great
exactly.
numbers, do they? So I suppose, and you're right. I think commercially, if you're coming at it from the commercial point of view, long form novels are still going to pay a lot more than short stories or short story collections. Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I mean, you know, I think what we can take from this is that we should both go and read more short fiction.
Read more, absolutely, yeah, and
and
I
then
think,
maybe
and I
try
think,
and write it. But yeah,
yeah, and I think understand the strengths and the uses of them as experiments or as freebies to get people to draw them into your own writing or to your networking or for competitions or for. I think for me that's the kind of stuff I would use them for rather than trying to make a living, I suppose, off them. I suppose that's
yeah.
kind of the way
I don't think you can, but you might have, like, some people do write both successfully.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
It goes against what I said earlier.
And
But,
then,
you know,
and then also,
it's possible to do both, and
Yeah,
it does
and
allow
look
you
at,
that experimentation, as you said.
what's his name? Ted. I've forgotten his surname.
Chang.
The Chang, is it? Yeah, the chap who wrote
Yeah,
The Arrival.
yeah,
Story of Your Life, the short story, which was obviously turned into Arrival, the movie. So there's, you know, it's not unheard of, obviously, but I think short stories can also be adapted into feature-length films just as much as novels can.
definitely.
So
I mean, look at Stephen King. Stephen King. Many
yeah,
Stephen King
most
short
of the movies
stories
are based on his short stories.
are
Yeah, that's
based
true.
on, you know,
That's true.
has had many.
Yeah, most of it,
successful films.
so many of his short stories. It's so
Yeah.
funny because you get so many of his short stories that you don't realize are based on his. There's so many films you don't realize are based on his short stories, but it's yeah. So
Although
yeah,
some
so
of
there's
his some of Stephen King's short stories are not short stories; they are novellas.
No, novellas, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's
you
another argument of how do you define a short story?
Exactly.
Stephen King is
but-
not the person to look at for the answer.
Yeah, exactly. As with, you know, I love Stephen King, but as with all his fiction,
Yeah,
uh,
he is
it
the outlier. He is
tends
not
not
the.
to be short. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's plenty of good ones. What I might do in the podcast description is try and give a few examples of some good,
That's a good
short
idea,
stories
yeah.
or short story
Yeah.
anthologies that
Yeah.
that I've read recently. And you know, you let us know about the short fiction that you've been enjoying in the comments as well. That would be really interesting.
And
to
where do
hear.
you find them? Are there places, are there decent magazine subscriptions that people should be looking at? You know, yeah, it'd be good to hear.
Yeah, please do that. But we will wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this episode, if you are watching on YouTube, be aware that you could have watched this episode at least 3 months ago on our Patreon. So yeah, if you subscribe to Patreon, you get these drafting notes episodes well in advance.
If you are watching this on YouTube as well, I'd just like to apologise for the absolutely shocking appearance. I'm on my MacBook's camera today, and it's really bad. And I'm just looking at these shadows. I'm also getting no sleep because my kid doesn't sleep at the moment. I look like absolute hell, so I just apologise. It's probably much better to
I
enjoy
didn't realise
an
you were
audio.
going to have a breakdown at the end of the episode. But, there you go. There's a bonus. Maybe that'll be the bit that draws people in. But we better wrap it up here before Tariq starts crying. And we'll be back soon with another drafting notes episode on our Patreon and in due course on YouTube as well.
See you later.